Okay, so inflation just dropped for the first time in 5 months. And honestly, on the surface, that sounds like the exact news we've all been desperately waiting for, right? It feels like we can finally take a breath. But before you go out and celebrate, we really need to take a hard look at the actual data driving this headline. Because as we're going to see in this explainer, you definitely shouldn't be breathing that sigh of relief just yet.
Let's start by looking at our big celebration number, 3.5%. That is the headline inflation rate that just came out for June 2026. Basically, this number tells us how fast prices rose over the past year. Now, when this report dropped, everybody was thrilled. On paper, it looks like a massive, undeniable win. I mean, 3.5% is exactly the kind of figure that makes both economists and everyday shoppers feel like, hey, things are finally cooling down, the pressure's coming off. But to really get why everyone was cheering, you have to look at the context. Just 1 month prior, in May 2026, inflation was sitting way up at 4.2%. Then, over a single 30-day stretch, it plummeted down to 3.5%. That is a remarkably steep drop for a massive macroeconomic indicator. It perfectly explains why the headlines were so overwhelmingly positive lately. A drop from 4.2 to 3.5, that is a stark, sudden shift downward over a very compressed amount of time.
So, what's the problem? If the data is pointing down so sharply, why shouldn't we be throwing a parade right now? Well, the truth is, top-line averages almost always mask the underlying mechanics of what's really going on. And to find the truth, we kind of have to stop being optimistic consumers for a second and start being investigative data readers. We have to dive beneath the surface of this supposedly amazing economic news to figure out what is actually pulling that average down so fast.
And when we do look beneath the surface, what we find is pretty concerning. The foundation of this entire drop is incredibly fragile. You can think of this inflation report almost like a giant iceberg. That 3.5% is just the tip sparkling in the sun above the water. But underneath, the massive structure supporting that number is highly volatile. Because the primary reason the headline dropped isn't that the whole economy is miraculously healing. It dropped because of a very specific, unstable category that could literally vanish tomorrow.
To understand this, we have to look at how international affairs are connecting directly to our domestic inflation. Let's rewind to early 2026. Tensions between the US and Iran pushed global energy prices through the roof. Gas, fuel oil, you name it, it spiked hard. That geopolitical mess was a huge reason why inflation had been relentlessly climbing for months. Then, in June, a ceasefire was reached, and the immediate result? Gas prices tanked. But here's the kicker. In recent days, those tensions have flared right back up. Basically, the geopolitical landscape across the globe is entirely dictating our inflation numbers at home.
The market's reaction to that June ceasefire was honestly staggering. Gas prices dropped by nearly 10% in a single month. 10%! When a major commodity like gasoline, which, remember, impacts transportation, daily commutes, almost every single sector of the economy, when it plunges that quickly, it creates massive statistical gravity. It essentially pulls all the other data down with it. To put that plunge into perspective, a 10% drop is the biggest one-month fall in gas prices we have seen since April 2020. And, well, we all remember exactly what was happening in the spring of 2020 to make global demand fall off a cliff. So seeing a drop of this magnitude in 2026 is an extreme, totally isolated shift. And this really is the magic trick behind our headline. This single, isolated plunge in gas prices is basically what dragged the entire overall average down to that magical 3.5%. Everything wasn't getting cheaper, gas was just getting a whole lot cheaper. Which brings us to a pretty stark reality check. On one hand, you have the absolute hero of the June inflation report, plummeting gas prices. But on the other hand, you have the reality of your actual wallet, where grocery prices are still steadily climbing. Cheaper gas at the pump is mathematically masking the serious ongoing pain you're feeling in the grocery aisle. The high-level data is screaming that things are great, but your weekly errands are telling you a completely different story.
Let's actually walk down the grocery aisle for a second to understand why food is completely defying the overall inflation trend. Take beef, for example. Beef prices are up sharply right now. Why? Well, we're currently facing a decade's low cattle supply. That is a hard, structural, agricultural reality. It has absolutely nothing to do with a ceasefire in the Middle East. Or look at tomatoes, where prices have been pushed up by new tariffs. Again, a very specific policy impact. These are the exact reasons your food bill isn't seeing that sudden relief you're getting on your gas budget. The mechanics driving grocery prices are just entirely different and way more stubborn than energy prices.
So we're left with this deeply frustrating contradiction.
While gas prices fell, grocery prices just kept on climbing. And it is absolutely crucial that we hold both of these truths in our head at the same time. The big headline number is loudly proclaiming that things are cooling off, but the fundamental cost of feeding your family, that tells a much more challenging story. So no, you are not crazy if your wallet still feels totally squeezed right now. The underlying data actually backs up exactly what you're experiencing.
And that leads us to the stark warning we really need to pay attention to next. Bringing our focus back to the global stage, we have to acknowledge a very hard truth. The geopolitical conflict did not magically go away. That ceasefire that triggered the historic 10% drop in gas, like we mentioned, tensions are already flaring up again. The conflict with Iran is still a highly active, totally unpredictable variable, which means the very thing that rescued our economy on paper in June is currently hanging by a thread.
This brings us to a concept that is absolutely vital for understanding our economy right now: fragile relief. This is when economic easing is driven by unpredictable, random geopolitical events, rather than an actual, structural stabilization of the economy itself. The U.S. economy isn't structurally healing. It's merely and probably temporarily benefiting from foreign affairs. True economic healing would mean seeing things like groceries, housing, and services all cooling down steadily, but instead, we're just riding the incredibly volatile waves of the international news cycle.
So here is the direct threat to your wallet moving forward. If geopolitical tensions continue to flare up in the Middle East, those cheap gas prices are going to reverse just as fast as they dropped. And if energy prices spike again because that ceasefire falls apart, the math works exactly the same way in reverse. That single category will drag the overall inflation average right back up. Meaning, next month's inflation report could completely erase this brief window of relief we just had, leaving us right back where we started, or honestly, maybe even worse.
So as we wrap up today's explainer, I want to leave you with a question. Look at your own life. Are prices actually easing for you, or does everything still feel just as expensive as ever? Because as we've uncovered today, a 3.5% headline doesn't really mean anything if it's built on a temporary dip in gas, while your daily essentials just keep getting more expensive. If one international flare-up can erase all of our economic progress overnight, are we actually on the road to recovery, or are we just standing right on the edge of the next cliff?